In the many examples you'll see tonight, Haegu Yang creates environments and sculptures that possess a narrative other than what is immediately visible. What we see in her work are objects that we live with every day: light bulbs, fans, window blinds, air conditioners, heaters, and cords that connect them all. Yet, unlike our domestic or work environments, these familiar items perform a larger role than their utilitarian functions. They are gathered to form new situations, assemblages of things that speak of poetry, politics, and human emotion. In recent works and exhibitions titled Lethal Love, Mountains of Encounter, Siblings and Twins, and Yearning Melancholy Red, Yang addresses these themes through specific historical personalities. And these characters are both familiar and obscure to us. They are the late French writer and filmmaker Marguerite Duras, the early 20th century Korean freedom fighter Kim San, and the American female journalist Nim Wales, who wrote him into history, and Petra Kelly, one of the main founders of the German Green Party, and her political and life partner Gert Bastian. The thread that connects these figures is the entanglement of politics and passion. All of these histories involve love and tragedy, the familiar subjects of documentaries or novels, yet Yang tells these stories in room-sized installations using Venetian blinds, light, shadow, and scent. So what does such an environment leave us to understand? It's important to note that these are not references that need be decoded, that her act of making is not one of illustration, but of abstraction. The notion of the abstract narrative is central to these works, and Yang talks about these two seemingly contradictory concepts not as opposites, but as a different form of language to talk about what we already share. The experiences of love and tragedy, for instance. So does it matter if we know all of the details of the story? That abstraction holds the potential for creating a shared experience is not something we immediately think of. Most of art history teaches us to understand abstraction as a contrast to representation, and that through recognizable pictures, we find a common ground. Yet the visceral experience of a spotlight, heat, breeze, and smell found in Yang's installations open up a different space for recognition, one that offers a story with many possible sides and indistinct interiors and exteriors. In the world of Hagu Yang, this ambiguity serves as a political ethic in the way that its potential meaning doesn't negate any particular reading. All experiences here are valid, creating a commonality in difference. In closing, let me return to the concrete. The talk tonight will take the form of a conversation. Haegue will be joined on stage by exhibition organizer Doryun Chong, who we are happy to claim as a former Walker staff member, although he has moved on to assume the role of associate curator of painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And Dorian and Haegue have enjoyed a long relationship, and some of that will come out in their conversation this evening as they lead us on an illustrated pathway through Haegue's various projects, eventually making their way to the story of the objects upstairs and the artistic and curatorial collaboration that made them come together. And after they've talked for a while, they will open up the conversation to your questions. And as they do that, I ask that you find one of the ushers in the aisles with a microphone to ask your question as the talk is being recorded this evening. So with that, please welcome Haegue Yang and Doryun Chong.
Thank you, Sarah, for the fantastic introduction. You never fail to amaze me with your amazing introductions. And Haegue and I were just sitting there on the first row and thinking that we could just sit here and listen to her, because she can probably talk about the exhibition and the work better than we perhaps can. So we decided that we're going to freestyle this presentation a little bit. Perhaps it's a little too self-referential or maybe even self-indulgent, but we thought it might be interesting for us to talk about how this exhibition came about. I think this behind narratives, and then we're going to talk about narratives and sort of anti-narratives along the way, is something that you don't necessarily see as viewers of an exhibition. So if you would indulge us a little bit for the next 40 minutes or so, then we will tell you how sort of our mutual understanding developed over the last few years through the process of getting to know each other, but also organizing particular and specific concrete projects in the last few years, and perhaps that will also illuminate what this exhibition is and how it came about. So we're going to play a little bit of ping pong. We're going to go back and forth and then sometimes talk over each other perhaps. But we wanted to begin with the beginning. So
the big things.
Which is my thank yous. So I haven't been gone away from Minneapolis and the Walker that long. I've been gone for the last 4 months, and this is my last exhibition. I had a great run here for, I think, 6 years, and this is my 8th exhibition. And as you can imagine, it's a challenge to bring a project into fruition, into concreteness when you're not physically present. So I have many people to thank. I would like to thank curatorial fellow Andrea Haegue, who assumed the role of doing all the dirty work and steering the exhibition from the abstract floor plan to what you see on the 7th floor in the Medtronic Gallery. And also really concretizing and materializing a seed of an idea, which is the residency that Haegue and I came up with one day in November 2008, sitting in her apartment in Berlin, and to see that turned into this series of amazing workshops and seminars that I hope you will see the result of when that becomes a public material. I really thank Andrea for all the hard work. Hey, thank you. And I would like to thank our new curatorial fellow, Bartholomew Ryan, for really stepping in at the last minute and organizing all the details and in helping Haegue through this great and complicated institution. I'd like to thank Walker's senior designer, Emmett Byrne, for the beautiful gallery guide that he made for the exhibition. I'd like to thank curatorial fellow Camille Washington also for just diving in, without having any time to really get used to the workings of the institution, but really dedicating herself to the residency. And bear with me for a couple more minutes. I would like to thank the Walker's amazing installation crew led by Scott Lewis. I'd like to thank Visual Arts Administrator Lynn Dirks for handling keeping tabs on all the details. And I don't know if Gwen's here today, but Walker's amazing registrar for the last 25 years, Gwen Bitts, who I tortured with 6 exhibitions, and this is my last exhibition with her, so my shout out to her. I miss you, Gwen. And grateful thank you to Chief Curator Darcy Alexander and the Walker Director Olga Viso for the unflagging support for this exhibition. Thank you very much. So that's done, and let's start with our beginning. So it was early September 2006. I was in Seoul with a couple of curatorial colleagues from the United States. I was in Seoul, South Korea. And a colleague of ours, Eun-ji Ju, who's now the director and curator of public programs and education at the New Museum in New York, had an invitation card, probably one of the most mysterious invitation cards to an exhibition I've seen. The exhibition was going to be held in a house in a city called Incheon, which is about an hour and a half away from Seoul. And Eun-ji insisted that we have to go see this exhibition. We had a very tight schedule. There were about 3 days, and there were many things that we wanted to do in Seoul. I knew who Haegue Yang was, but we had never had a chance to meet face-to-face, in person, and so we decided to go. So we took a commuter train, which took about an hour and a half, and then we had to take a taxi for another 10 minutes, and then we met at possibly one of the most pathetic looking bars I've seen around the corner. Quite nostalgic, this sort of place. And then she guided us through these narrow alleyways that led to the house you're looking at, which clearly had been abandoned for a long time. But it was a fascinating place because in a country where memories are being erased so radically through massive modernization that just seems to be not stopping, it was just fascinating to see a house that was built in possibly early 20th century, I think, in a Japanese style, with a beautiful courtyard, very low ceiling, and very tiny rooms, one leading to another. And there was, in the courtyard, a rusted refrigerator with a text on it that said, something to the effect of, "Thank you for making such a long trek. Please have some beverage inside, cool beverage inside the refrigerator. Take your time and enjoy." So we spent about an hour there looking through the house and the rooms, which were transformed by really little gestures that were quite magical. And perhaps it was the function of the space that, because we weren't in an area with a lot of galleries and museums, and we felt like we had to go from one exhibition to another. But we made a one-way trip that took almost 2 hours, and then we knew that we're blowing off a whole afternoon. So perhaps we decided to kind of enjoy the experience with a bit of an abandon. And as you can see in the images, the slideshow that you're looking at, Haegue's interventions into this space were modest, with light bulbs here and there, very colorful origami polyhedrons that were stacked in corners. There was also a mirror somewhere, little Christmas lights, and possibly my personal favorite was one of those clothes drying rack that was doing a jumping jack in a room, wearing something like a coat. So I could really claim that it was one of those, you get a little cynical perhaps when you're a curator and then your job is traveling and then seeing as many exhibitions as possible. And sometimes it just feels like one experience just bleeds into another, and it turns into almost like your job is trying to remember facts and details as much as possible without necessarily thinking about what that experience was. So there was a great kind of generosity on the part of the artist, I felt, as well as great luxury in being able to willingly isolate yourself in a space that you would least expect, and just kind of enjoy that experience with an abandon. What more can I say about that? Should we go to the next? So later, as I got to know Haegue better, and as we started having one conversation after another, I began to gain a bigger context. And the year 2006, I found out, was a great turning point, a very important turning point for her. And her work changed direction conceptually, intellectually, and formally. And Sadong 30, did I mention the title? Sadong 30 was the address of the abandoned house, and that was the title of the installation she did, was sort of one of the twin projects that the artist did in 2006, and the other took place in a very interesting small institution called Bach in Utrecht in the Netherlands. So I'll ask Haegue to talk about that project a little bit.
As the Dorian mentioned, 2006 became quite a significant period of time where I had a luxury to experiment with many things. Experiment in a sense, not like small trials, but like I had to mobilize my courage to initiate certain project. I still cannot quite figure out where did I have this courage to initiate those projects. And Chadong 30 was certainly one of it. I carried around the idea of having a self-organized project outside of an institution for a long time. And I got a company who is a young Korean curator who had a similar desire, I guess, to work with the artists closely for one project and not really bothered by the ordinary institutional framework of public relation, getting a media, and so it became for both of us kind of existential project as a human being as well as professionals. And the second project, what I'm going to talk about is has a very different framework. It is very clearly an institutional project, which we usually describe solo exhibition. And I had another great curator to work with, Pinna Choi, and she offered a residency that I can stay there 4 months and just devote myself in research and just concentrate myself in developing a new project. And right before I came to Utrecht, I had a 1.5 year break that I didn't produce any work, and I had got a full-time job, so I was like officially not on service as an artist. And I guess this 1.5 years of time plus the 4 years residency brought me to initiate this project. The exhibition is titled Unevenly, which brought a lot of discussion within the institution as well as outside of the institution, because it associate kind of politically incorrect statement. Like, we are actually quite used to make things communicating with outside like democratically, and unevenly sounds like, you know, not proper. Like, it caused a lot of misunderstandings. But what I meant by unevenly in that constellation was distribution, the uneven distribution of senses, which were just scattered around in the space without telling a specific story. So as you see in the images, there is no paintings, no sculptures, no video work. There were video work, but not the usual video work illustrating something. There were, instead of the traditional art pieces, there were devices, infrared heaters, humidifiers, scent emitters. Those were just standing and take up certain zone and just working for itself, creating different sensory territories. And that was the first time I used the title Series of Vulnerable Arrangement. This piece particularly has a subtitle version, Utrecht. I never imagined I would use this title over and over again, but that was also happened at that exhibition. You might wonder why this kind of project needs so much courage. I mentioned previously. I think the language, the formal language of installation, consisting of the technical devices, that wasn't really in my previous work. As I remember, if I remember right, I was working a lot with the furnitures, but not particularly with the devices. And of course, there are similar functions between furnitures and devices. They are kind of portraying figures or certain sentiments and emotional stories, but not thoroughly. So we don't really hear their concrete stories, but there were definitely some narratives going on, but we are abandoned in the space by this machine which seems like very self-contained. So the change of the language took me some strength, and I have to say I felt in fact very vulnerable when I opened this exhibition. But what then again support me a lot was the research what I could achieve during the residency, finding some philosophers, writers, and who seems to share similar ideas. So bearing those things, I kind of attempt to find my own language, and that was the result of this exhibition. We might maybe come back to these specific figures and philosophy later on.
Well, I didn't get to see the exhibition, but Bach produces this really neat announcement of their programs, which are sort of brochures. And I received the brochure that went with your residency and exhibition, and on the cover was a picture of this Asian man who turned out to be a Korean man who was wearing one of those signs that are inscribed in Chinese characters as people were subjected to wear during the Cultural Revolution and public criticisms. And I could make out a little bit, few of the characters, and it announced who he was. His name was Kim San. And it said something about how he was charged with treason and was arrested by the Japanese consulate. This was during the time when China was semi-colonized and Japan was one of the imperial powers that was there. And then inside was another picture, one of those kind of early 20th century glamour shots of this American journalist that Sarah mentioned. Her name is Nim Wales, which was nom de plume for a woman named Helen Foster Snow. And she was from Utah, and she got on a steamship to Shanghai when she was, I think, 22 or 23 years old. Almost immediately met someone named Edgar Snow, who's best known as the first Western writer who was part of Mao's Long March. So he joined the Long March and wrote the first, I guess, kind of biographical narrative about Mao and the great communist revolution in China. So I remember thinking, I can't remember whether that came before my visit to Korea and seeing the Sadong 30 exhibition or afterwards, but it must have been before. So I remember seeing this and reading these stories and just feeling a little bit confused by what is the relationship between these stories that I'm learning about and pictures of the installation that I'm seeing in the brochure and on the website. So I think that sort of kind of sowed seeds of curiosity. And then somehow, but I didn't make the connection between that kind of experience of learning about an artist's work once removed, and that experience of actually seeing the installation in Korea. But I think that was sort of the beginning before the beginning without realizing it. So, and the images that you see are, I guess, the next iteration of Series of Vulnerable Arrangements, which is titled Series of Vulnerable Arrangement Blind Room. And you're seeing mostly images of the installation when it was originally created in situ for the Sao Paulo Biennial in 2006. And when you see it in a more brighter images, that was the recreation that was done here at the Walker for a group exhibition I organized with Yasmil Raymond in 2007 titled Brave New World. So perhaps if you could talk a little bit about how the Utrecht version Utrecht, became Blind Room in Sao Paulo.
Since I was so focused on this particular democratic field of senses, like I mean the field with different sensory experiences, but not distributed like evenly that we have like the one conclusion. It went to every possible direction with individual associations. But what I was not so aware of at the exhibition of Unevenly was the mapping of the entire space as a body of work. So somehow this work, Blind Room, contains the same types of senses, devices, as well as the so-called trilogy, the video essays I completed 2006. The formal language are in two works very different. I guess I don't know if you remember the several pieces of blind in the previous piece in Unevenly. I used the blind already, but only for functional reason to filter the light for video projection, which were incorporated in a installation. But I was amazed by the effect of blind, which make the space like well divided, but at the same time not shut down at all, and like visually as well as so like sensory way, that the smell could come over as well as the breeze while the light were filtered, but I could quite much see what's going on outside at the same simultaneously viewing the video piece. So when I got the invitation for the Sao Paulo, I conceived like second version of a series of vulnerable arrangement, but particularly concentrated in wrapping this installation with the blind, which makes entire installation transparent. So these fields were wrapped, but also divided by blind into several cells and paths. So it became more articulated zone, but not necessarily graspable in a sense that it doesn't have, like solid body. Since the hall was long and giant, this became a kind of invisible but half visible object that you could look through, going through. But then again, there was a specific ritual happening, and I guess this was the first time I kind of consciously started to work with the material Venetian blind, and this geometric language of the blind slots, as well as the ability of like forming certain space, breaking at the same time, allowing like experiences going through, became a big attraction. And as Dorian briefly mentioned about the Korean modern history of continuous break, that this discontinuity and continuity was probably inscribed in my mind as like unseparable principle, and I guess that's how I got into the half transparency of the blind as a material. And the other version I created at the Walker, or reconstruction, of course brought me like another consciousness and confidence in this piece. So this became like another birth than the Utrecht version, to commit myself in series of installation happened in 2007 and 2008.
and there's what this was my experience and memory of how of making the walker version, which was just like the origami polyhedrons that you see on the table. It almost seemed like you were beginning to use the blinds to begin to fold the blinds, almost like origami themselves, and they start creating rooms. And then it felt much more sort of tightly controlled and orchestrated, because you walk into the space and the first thing that you experience is an air conditioner that's suspended above your head, giving you a cold shower of air. And you walk in a little bit, immediately you're confronted with this warmth from infrared heater, and then there was a highlight, and there was a humidifier. So, and then at one point you talked about how our waking hours are so filled with these perceptual experiences in public spaces that we go through without thinking, such as, passageways, airports, train stations. But you also talked about how you wanted to kind of invoke those feelings.
I think there are something very mundane and abstract about the senses I'm using, because warmth could be nasty, but as well as comforting. And same goes for every senses I use. They are very open with their associations. But that openness, I particularly found it democratic in a sense that it doesn't force anybody to associate in a certain way. Like any individual association can be unfolded. But then again, I, as an artist, don't give up my chance or option to unfold my own self-referential narratives. So this equal or like democratic negotiation between me as an expressing person and sharing that with the audience in an open way, but like not giving myself up, was the attraction to start to work with the senses particularly. And I guess the language and the narratives, like narrative in this case, is not only the literature, but also like every types of didactics maybe. Those kind of structure, like narrative, such as narratives and language, didn't really allow me to have that particular type of freedom than to work with the sense experiences. So
around and since the recreation of Series of Vulnerable Arrangement Blind Room at the Walker, and that piece also now belongs to the Walker collection, you started creating a series of Venetian blind and device installations, and you're seeing one of them, which you created at Kunstwerk in Hamburg, titled Mountains of Encounter. So this was sort of further extension or elaboration of your exploration of the lives of Kim San and Nim Wells.
Right. I think, as Dorian mentioned, I already started to research on these two figures, or better to say, relationship between these two figures in 2006, that I used the portrait of two figures in a newsletter of Bach. But I didn't particularly focus on the figures. And with this piece, Mountains of Encounter, I commit myself to embrace, I call it like foreign narratives, like alien narratives. It's not the self-referential narrative. To develop series of large-scale installation. And there are some symbolic languages such as the color and the movement, but overall, what is happening in this installation is I tame certain narrative and then unlearn it completely. That as a result, in a spatial experience, there is a voice, but not telling on any story. And I guess this distinction between narrative and voice became clear, and as well as again to deepen the understanding of light and Venetian blind. So just to describe shortly this installation, how it works is that there are 4 moving lights making a very strong white circle and moving slowly, touching each corner and surfaces of blind. And the Venetian blinds, 22 Venetian blinds are used in order to make a kind of spiral shape of mountain. Thus each slope goes up and up while it getting inside. So it's kind of, you can walk in, but you can also see outside. And the light is penetrating the surface to get into, but of course every time it filtered. And there are 2 floodlights installed in the center, like deepest part of the spiral labyrinth, which dims on and off slowly. So the whole structure is kind of breathing while the circle lights are touching and penetrating and reinforce the geography of the blind. So the circle kind of break this intensive color of red while it reveals the structure of the horizontal lines. So there are kind of interaction between these 2 primary materials, and don't ask me which material is whom, but there is this encounter or interaction or interdependency to create this certain choreography.
Well, Kim San and Nim Wells met in Yan'an, right? Which was for a while. This is during the civil war between the Chinese communists and the nationalists, before the communists ultimately proved victorious. And Yan'an is in mountainous area of I think Western China. And after their sort of chance encounter, they have this intense meetings for about 20 days, and that's when Nim Wells writes down, dictates, or Kim San dictates his life story, and Nim Wells writes down, which she turns into his biography after his death, without knowing his death actually. So, and this is obviously very situation of urgency during wartime and revolutionary war. So when you see red, you think about revolution and blood and communism, and also the sort of the narrative fact of 2 figures that you were thinking about meeting in a mountainous landscape, but also you were talking about how it was important that you were taming and then unlearning the narrative. So what was the tension between the landscape that you had in your mind and the process of unlearning?
The landscape of this Yean was like concrete landscape where these 2 figures were met, but at the same time this landscape which was built in my mind was nameless encounters of possible figures who had maybe similar relationships, such as Kim San's and Nim Wells. As the Kim San was one of maybe countless independent fighter who lived in most of their lifetime in underground without any fixed name and identity. I was interested in this nameless and faceless figure, how they enter into the history by the help of whom, and that was a particular methodology of reading a history, what I wanted to learn, maybe not necessarily learning about the Kim San and Nim Wells. So there was rather for me the attempt to find my own reading of history. It doesn't matter it's like Korean history or Mexican history. There was a desire. That is the what I can relate, how I can relate to a notion of history. As this piece was shown in a group show called Whose History, there were many artists invited who revealed their way of reading of history. So I think this installation gave me an opportunity to approach the figures on my own way, that how I can make them universal without like distorting their historical significance. So that was another types of unlearning I had to go through.
And another grouping of historical figures that you have been exploring and learning and unlearning really intensively is the French author Marguerite Duras, and the two men in her life, her husband Robert Antem and her lover Dionys Mascolo. So you've made several blind installations that came out of your relationship, your sort of kind of historiographical relationship with these figures. And what you're looking at are installation views of, I guess you can say, the latest and the last installation about the relationship between these figures, titled Yearning, Melancholy, Red. So the excuse me, the installation views are from gallery at Red Cat in Los Angeles when it was presented in June 2008, and it's the centerpiece of the current Walker exhibition that opened today upstairs. So perhaps you can talk a little more about your fascination with Duras, which is also this kind of linchpin of your residency activities, and what was the trajectory that got you to this particular installation, and what were the things that were resolved in your mind?
I think I want to start with a kind of excuse why I have to like make such a long introduction for every single piece, is that my work became like very evolutionary, that one depends on the previous piece, and the previous piece is like has another predecessor, and it became, whether I want it or not, it became like very interdependent, interrelated with each other. And Yearning, Melancholy, Red is one of these very interrelated installation with another previous pieces, such as like Three Kinds, which I showed at Carnegie International, as well as another piece called 5 Rue Saint-Benoît, which was the Marguerite Duras Parisian apartment, where she lived and met many French intellectuals and started to act as a resistance. And those works, as well as Yearning, Melancholy, Red, use the Marguerite Duras as a trigger, excuse, alibi, confirmation, and etc. In this particular case, her childhood became my interest. She was born and raised and lived in Indochina, which was a French colony, until she became 18, before she went to Paris to study. And where how I understand her childhood, I mean, my interpretation of her childhood might be very idiosyncratic as my reading of Kim San and Lee Well's encounter. But nevertheless, I understand her childhood is living in a double isolation, in which your dignity as a French colonizer was not there, while she couldn't be one of these natives in Indochina.
Because she was impoverished, her family was impoverished.
Yeah, their family were extreme poverty, and her mother is a fighter who fought for her life in Indochina as well as for her family, but wasn't successful battle, and she was not beloved child, but she witnessed that childhood, and there are many elements very confusing. Her life is in general very contradictory for me, but that became a big attraction to me, as well as her invention or memory about her childhood. There is also very blurred line between the fact and fiction by Marguerite Duras in general about her life, and then her childhood, let's say, wasn't an exception, and we don't know how much she really enjoyed or how much she was aware of political situation. However, her childhood also seemed to me very similar to my own thinking on about my childhood, how I grown up with the heavy modernization and industrialization process, which felt brutal, but there was many moments that I was not suffering by it. And why is it? How could I not suffer so much? Almost enjoying the brutal construction, as well as suffer by all this dust, by the big trucks passing by on a road where the division between pedestrian and automobile were not there. And I think another touching point between Duras and me in terms of the childhood was the isolation I felt, and my particular isolation was a kind of curiosity, how I could devote myself in art and not in politics, which was a big mystery to me, and what kind of politicalness then I can still embrace in my work. The overall sentiment in the piece is almost like you are inside of somebody. I think the use of color red in this piece is slightly different than Mountains of Encounter. It doesn't come from the blind as a material. The blinds are white mostly, and they are colored by the intensive light. And the individual sometimes cannot really resist the environment, but then again, it's colored temporarily. It's a light, but it's not the color as a physicality. And I think this coloring effect, very intensive coloring. It's not a color something to decorate. It's very thorough coloring, as if you are soaked into a paint. Was very important point, as well as the center point with the mirrors, which unfold the space in a confusing way, as if it can go on and on.
And there are 3 pairs of fans and heaters.
Yes, the setting of these 2 different devices are rather contradictory than compensatory. They are squandering their energy, they are contradicting to each other, but they are deliberately facing to each other. And I guess these are other figures living in this jungle of cable, blinds, and choreography of intensive light.
And what really sets this apart from the previous installations or scenes is the inclusion of the drum kit, which serves as element of interactivity, while you don't necessarily believe in interactive or participatory art making.
Did we talk about it in the gallery? I think so.
Yeah, a little bit. But can you speak a little more?
Yeah. I think what I remember how I answer in the gallery guide is I'm particularly not advocating interactive art practices in general, I somehow don't have the belief in it. So this is one of very few pieces you kind of act within my piece. You're welcome to interact with my piece. But it was not intention to invite somebody. I think it was rather, again, focus on me losing my control over the choreography of the light. That there are two modes for moving light. One is a default setting, that the usual languid move of lighting, touching every single corners and making a red shadow on the wall. But as soon as somebody plays the drum kit, the lighting transform into the so-called random mode, that the movement is triggered by the sound and not by me. So you can't really control, and the spatial construction is doesn't allow the drum player see the result of the choreography. So you kind of trigger the movement of light, but you probably is the least person who has overview of what's happening in the piece. So there is a kind of exclusion of the power, even if it is there must be a power to trigger this movement. So there is the first step for me was like giving my power onto someone, but this person is not that powerful that he can really compose things. So there is a kind of handicap power going on for the drum player.
So this sort of intentional unlearning and losing has been the part of process, a cumulative process that's been going through this series of installations that you've been making in the last couple of years. So maybe like really quickly we can talk about the perhaps one of the largest installations that you made in Venice, where you're representing the Republic of Korea in the Venice Biennale that's on right now. And then you wanted to use the architecture, which lets in a lot of natural light, and there are doors on both sides, so you experience draft going through the building. And it was really important that you use the natural light in this case, in contrast with the previous installations, which were all about control and choreography, or less and less control perhaps. But in this case, it seemed like you really opened it up to potentials of unpredictability.
After I have achieved like series of large-scale installation powered by theatrical light, I had another great opportunity to realize big project. There was a problem and also challenges. The first one was, as Dorian mentioned, was the architectural framework of Korean pavilion in Venice, which feels almost like a glass pavilion. So in order to recreate my ordinary or even like stereotypical light installation, I had to cover everything, and I was never a big fan of like spending resources to build the wall and cover the window. On top of it, I felt a certain urgency to turn myself into the different direction, and as I have achieved through the drum kit in Yearning Melancholy Red. So that was kind of reducing the element of the theatrical light completely. So there is no theatrical moving lights at all. So the lights are fully there in the pavilion, but it's a different types of light. This is just a daylight. It changes every day, even every single second as the time goes by. So it is not controllable, matter of fact. And So another challenge for me is, okay, so color of the blind became a issue. I have a great difficulty to choose color because of the symbolics of color and all. So though I often let myself into certain circumstance that I don't need to choose the color. Like for instance, the color white is just colored by the light. It's a kind of coloring, but not really composing. In this case, so I kind of started to thinking about how to avoid working with colors. So what I choose here in Venice for the installation called the Voice and Wind was the patterns. Like you might think, okay, this is multiple colors of a blind, but they actually have a heavy, quite crazy patterns, like even cheesy and largely domestic. Like some of them are imitating marbles,
Right.
and faux wood, and like very ridiculous, old-fashioned 60 types of like crazy metallic, all different types of. So this was the maximum patterns I could get from the fabricator and suppliers who I worked with. So that was another, like, how can I describe it, like indirect or passive, being passive intentionally, not to compose, not to have the power to compose things. And only choreography I did, which I usually do for the lighting, was the choreography of wind. There are 6 wind machines are installed in various sizes and powers, and they were very carefully programmed. They make blinds subtly move, like kind of very subtle movement or almost a dance, and they even make the sound, make the blind sound, like making some noises. And so another unlearning process might be losing particular references. So after completed the piece at Red Cat, June 2008, I kind of wanted to go back to my self-referential way, that I don't have any particular figures in my mind anymore. There were just lots of voices in my head, and some of them were definitely the figures who I worked with for previous pieces, but there were much more voices of other Korean colleagues who were big inspirations, and myself, but like many of myself, not the singular self. So these voices were transferred through the wind. So there are actually no narrative, but the winds are synonym of the voice. And
So maybe we should take a few more minutes and talk about the rest of the exhibition a little bit. So once we started talking, because Medtronic Gallery has glass wall that's looking out onto one of the walkers' terraces, and because light and shade, shadow have been really important elements to you, you were really interested in keeping at least part of the wall. So when you walk into the gallery, what you will see is the most bright space, which is enhanced by the whitest, brightest fluorescent lighting that we could find. And this is one of the pieces that are titled Whatever Beings, that are, the dimensions are taken from A4, A3, A2 sizes, standardized paper sizes that are used in most countries, not in this country, but most countries. And they are subtle relief sculptures that are somewhere between 2-dimensionality and 3-dimensionality, and somehow disappear into the wall, but also appear. And then there, should we keep moving a little bit? And then you go into So these are sort of older installation shots, so this isn't how the gallery looks exactly, but sort of we wanted to go through some of the works that you're going to see upstairs. The work on the left, which is a work from a series titled Non-Folding. So you've been doing a lot of this folding and unfolding, and you came up with this term non-folding, which is unfolding that is itself a process of making. They can take various forms. And geometry has been another important element to you. In this case, perhaps most humorously, you're making the drying racks, the foldables, doing gymnastics. More like a yoga or something. And then there are some, perhaps like almost nakedly self-reflexive and confessional work, which I consider this to be, titled Quasi-MB, MB being the initial of the late Belgian conceptualist Marcel Brotter. And in the gallery, what you will see is Brotter was a poet and conceptual artist and also filmmaker, and one of the films that the Walker has in the archive collection was a very short 2-minute long film called La pluie, un projet pour un texte, Rain, a project for a text. And you see the artist sitting in his backyard in Brussels and starts writing on a piece of paper, but almost immediately rain starts falling on him, erasing what is writing, so you cannot see what is writing on the paper. And here, over the course of, what, about 2 years, that you mimic and imitate and sort of start having an imaginary conversation.
Right.
And there are several pieces that contain light and shadow in and of themselves. And this is a piece titled Duo, as in outside in French. Could you talk a little bit about what you did here?
Yes, the two horrors, you might wonder of maybe the other selection of work which we showed up until now might make more sense in terms of the shadow, light, casting shadow, kind of like slippery beings, as if like as that whatever being suggests, and the notion of subjectivity as like an ungraspable ontological being. And then here we go, the horrors carries a very specific imagery of like a city development. It seems maybe addressing like issues which were not inherent in other pieces, but we've selected this piece because of the quality of the half transparency and like deleting the narrative, which were in this case newspaper articles. And maybe I should start to describe where this material comes from. It's daily newspapers advertising for not yet built buildings. So these are mostly like illustration or simulation, better to say,
of real estate developments.
Right. So as you see, these are very exaggerated manner of utopian or very petit bourgeoisie dream of like better life or something like that. So of course, when I started to collect this material, I was very critical and furious about this development, and of course they were like total oddities to my mind, and this carries these advertising carries the residential building, commercial development as well as holiday bungalows and all types of, like projected desire, let's say, from the side of developers, but also to appeal the consumer, like appeal the homeless people who are looking for a home or better life. And I was, I think my relationship with this material were changed over the course of time while I was collecting these newspapers, in a sense that from, let's say, like from like criticizing into a certain type of empathy. Like I felt like one of them, this being completely lost and being homeless, and like almost like pathetic empathy that I felt for like unknown people who were desperately looking for a kind of utopia was certainly a type of a romance that I had with the unknown residents of this not existing dystopia, you say? So this again brings up my tie or my relationship with faceless beings. And it doesn't matter if it is A4 paper or exaggerated newspaper imagery or Marcel Brothers, who I respect and admire, but at the same time who alienates me, were probably the member of community who I aspiring for. And there is I probably have to start to talk about my understanding of like subjectivity. Me as one of them, like subjectivity as very singular person, but can't even deny the plurality in me or deny any aspiration for multiple subjectivities, generating a community, but without excluding anybody, was a starting point. And as my research proceeded, I came up with the great conformational notion of community of absence. And if there is a community, so many community for different types of interest and shared needs, there must be the rest of all this community. And this is another type of community that you belongs to like preconditionally, but then again, without even knowing who are all in that community. So that was often called by philosopher as community of absence or negative community, which gave me a great enlightenment, let's say, that I was maybe instinctively felt but didn't know how to describe. In terms of the exhibition title here at Walker open tonight, The Integrity of Insider, there is it's a similar relationship like how I titled the exhibition in Utrecht as Unevenly. There is a slight offness in my use of vocabulary. I think most of us don't really have a big objection about integrity. Like it's a quality and it's very aspiring quality. The insider might make you a little bit puzzled. Why insider? What types of insider? Within what situation or in which framework? The word insider, I think, could be very, very positive as soon as the frame can be, not that conventional way of, way of structuring the group. I think this type of community of negative would not make us afraid of being an insider, even with great integrity. And I'm not suggesting the skilled insider or recognized insider. I think with this kind of disturbed combination of words, I would like to suggest to think about the framework in which we could be an insider.
I think that's a great point to open the floor up to Q&As.
I have a question to ask about the Venetian blinds that you have that are in color. Did you go to a Venetian blind place and ask for the different colors? When you had them in yellow and blue and other colors? How did you go about getting the different colors?
Intuitive.
From what's available by the manufacturers.
But like the order, I still have to, of course, make the number of each sled in which pattern, and then what is the order of each. Like there were so many colors and so many patterns, even if they felt very limited to me.
Mm-hmm.
But there is no compositional rule. I made it intuitive, which felt right. And of course, I made the flow of color, which means one started with the pink in that height, and the other was maybe red or brown, and there was a flow certainly. But it wasn't, let's say, more than the conventional way of let things flow. So it's a combination of instinct, like intuitive, and like conventional composition. There is no big mystery behind it.
All right, so I was debating with my friend here. Did I see snakes and other animals through the blinds?
Animals?
Okay, so there was different color blinds, and all of a sudden, I looked through a couple of them. I thought I saw a snake and an alligator through a couple of them. Was I just seeing that myself?
Illusions or projections.
It happens.
Hi, thanks for the great talk that made me reflect a lot upon what I just saw upstairs. I've read about Haegue Young's work just from the texts that were written for the previous exhibitions across the world. And it's really sort of very inspirational to see the work in person for the first time after reading about the inspirational philosophers or historical figures that you refer back to or create stories about. So talking about the loose associations, loosely sort of organized and coordinated associations and encounters, it was interesting to see how you too began the talk by referring back to your first encounter. And as sort of an aspiring art critic, I want to know more about, I guess, the encounter that is, sort of you had great conversation, but in terms of looking at Nim Wales and Kim San, how one individual enters into history. So how you two work together to bring one or the other into contemporary discourse of art. Is that too much of an abstract question, or?
So do you want us to be very personal or professional?
Well, well, personal is political. Well, perhaps this isn't quite the answer, but it makes me really think a lot and reflect a lot about the experience of this sort of intense, ongoing conversation that took the form of literally talking face to face, emailing back and forth, but also writing essays and doing interviews, which I did a lot in the last few years. It has been a kind of interesting experience because you would sort of expect that by doing it more and more, that somehow it becomes easier and easier. And I have to confess that that wasn't quite the case for me vis-a-vis Haegue's work, which I'm not saying to blame her for her work, but it's sort of really kind of sharpened, really kind of perhaps a fraught relationship of what it means to be a curator working with a contemporary artist. And in a recent interview that Haegue did, not with me, but for an art magazine, she said something like, I don't know how casual you were when you were saying this, that if a curator knows an artist's work about 10%, that's pretty big, and which just plunged me into just worse depression, professional depression in my career, but for a short moment. And then I got out of it, and then sort of realized that perhaps that's why we developed, for me at least, developed a kind of professional relationship that continued, that not necessarily building on what my knowledge of her work is, but it was almost like, I thought that I had a grasp on her body of work, what her practice is, but then each time it's almost like a ball that kept turning and I had to constantly grasp it, like came up with another grasp. So, that's not to say anything about, that's what makes Haegue Yang's work better than other practice or anything like that. But, there is something about this practice that challenge is such a banal word, but that was, and slippery is another slippery word. That really kind of forced me to redefine my relationship and sort of my interpretive view of the work. But I think, I think I can also kind of assume that whether it's actual interviews or interpretive essays or whatnot, I think there's also kind of back and forth in the sense that misinterpretation or incomplete interpretation can also lead to further conversation.
Yeah, I think the conversation or communication between curator and artist are not always like efficient, meaning like it doesn't have like specific goal or like purpose. So we communicate, but it's not really maybe focused because you develop and I develop. But on top of it, I think there is a fundamental belief by me in relationship that, like I have to eventually have to be unknown to you. And you have to be like completely unknown to me in order to maintain the relationship. As soon as like I have a feeling of know someone, I think it's kind of, like concluding things. And I think we don't build up that kind of relationship. And we don't allow ourselves be in that consolational relationship, I guess, in general. There is like fundamental inefficiency in a relationship of knowing each other.
Squandering enormous amount of energy,
Always.
like the heater and the fan.
But then again, for me, there is a maybe humane aspect of working with certain curators intensively, like unforgettably, is of course as a artist who lives in this world, as a fact of a birth and growing old and making number of shows, is that we became of course the witness of each other, and that has nothing to do with the efficiency or inefficiency I talked about, but we certainly are or became a witness of each other. And this is my generation, my lifetime, and there are certain people around who can speak about me, and it may be maybe only 10% of what I understand of what I'm doing, but 10%, they are the witness. And I also deliberately wanted to be a witness of certain curators and writers who I work with. They are my collaborators, and it's a very important element of my life.
Could I actually ask another question about the exhibition itself? So we learned a lot about the works individually. How would you envision sort of the walking trajectory of the viewer in the space of stairs in terms of creating maybe another narrative, or not? Or
Well, I think it's a combination of pragmatics and intuition at the stage of planning. So we knew that we wanted to feature Yearning Melancholy Red as the centerpiece. And the very first decision we made was that we've done sort of a new production where we recreated Blind Room in 2007, and since then, Haegue's schedule has been so impacted for a couple of years with new productions of new blinds that the first goal for me as an institutional curator here was that I didn't want to do any new production. That I wanted it to be an opportunity for me and for the institution, and especially for the artist, to look back on her own trajectory in the last few years. So that was the first decision that was made, which is why we decided that the existing piece that she did at Red Cat was going to be the centerpiece. Then it became logical that we also wanted to show, because now that took up about 2/3 of the space, right? So, and then we have 1/3 of fairly small space, and then pragmatics come in, and you decide that you will include smaller pieces. Then logics and intuition become part of what pieces will fit and inform one another. But I think another important organizing principle was that given how so many of our works of large scale and small scale and of different mediums are about kind of collapsed boundaries of light and shadow, that we wanted the space to also feel that way. So the first space will be the brightest, and the second space will be compromised but also enhanced kind of space, and the third will be the darkest but also the most intense experience of light. So, so there was a certain goal, there was an organizing principle, and the rest of it, we just sort of kind of snake through it with logic and intuition. Is that fair?
I'd like to ask about the role of history in your process, and as you're researching something, what places along the process of conceiving and executing a work, where does it enter? Is it part of the conception, or do you start to draw on it as the physical forms are happening, and at that point you put them together?
The shortest answer would be there is no rule for that. I don't really develop any strategy how I especially treat the history. I mean, I think each figure kind of has individual entry into my thinking, and they are treated by me individually. And while I kind of had like very short, like kind of sting, like do you say a sting? It came up like, yeah, it came up very quickly.
Flash.
Yeah,
Flash
like a
intuition.
flash.
Yes.
But it didn't stay so long. Was Petra Kelly, and
One of the founders of German Green Party.
right, and like figure like Duras, it stayed long, and I don't know why.
Okay, one last question.
I'm curious about how the objects in the installations are actually physically made, and wondering how much you actually do with your own hands, how much you design and give to someone else to construct. For example, the origami pieces or the roping of lights around an armature. Is that something that you kind of stand back as a choreographer and direct people, or do you actually get in there and start wrapping lights around a pole?
Speaking about like what's really happening in the studio, I think I have to admit that I have very strange way of working. I think in one hand, I would never give up to make things by myself with my hands. But at the same time, like a big portion of like large-scale installation, I just have to let somebody build. Meaning I can make models and order the material, but I cannot even assemble them in my little home. So there is a great insecurity in realizing big project. And my skill didn't really develop so quickly enough that I feel very unsure about each time, but the kind of handicapped relationship with scale, technique, and space also make in this case, a good balance that I have a desire to compensate that handicap with maybe more mental process. And I don't know how it will last like this, but that's how I am right now, and it didn't really change over even if I had many projects to realize each time, like very challenging, great opportunity which I couldn't fail, but I stayed like more or less okay without any space where I could perfect where I could make a perfect rehearsal of the installation. So again, back to the real question, I think many things I make as much as I can do in my studio. The rest of them I have to give away.
Thank you very much.
Okay.